Welcome to the Loved Called Gifted podcast. This is your place to come for musings about spirituality, identity and purpose. I'm your host, Catherine Cowell. I'm really delighted this episode to be joined by Sarah Clarke from the Church Mission Society. Thank you ever so much for joining us, Sarah. Do you want to just introduce yourself?
Yeah, Sarah Clarke. I lead the undergraduate programme at CMS. So we train people doing their degrees, undergraduates and masters and DTHs in theology, ministry and mission. And my specialism, or at least what my doctorate is in, is philosophical and theological aesthetics. That's the area that I care about, I think.
Okay. So do you want to give us a bit of a definition of that?
Oh, such a difficult thing. I should not have said anything. Really, the thing I look at, so aesthetic, you can walk down the high street or, down the main street in any town, and you see things that say beauty and aesthetics or dentists and aesthetics. We've kind of reduced this word aesthetics or indeed beauty to sort of what people look like. But aesthetics really kind of covers a plethora of different things. And so it's the sort of feeling, it's the mystery, the sort of non-tangible things that we can't quite grasp hold of. And I look at through what we might think of as the thing beauty. So what is that experience that we have of beauty and why is it important? So you'll experience beauty through the arts. You could think of it as being awe and wonder. So the top of a mountain or being at the cinema and the hairs go up on the back of your neck. What is that experience? And where that sort of lands itself in my job is how do we think of the creative or art as part of a spiritual journey? And why is art or the expression of art and creativity a really important thing? And with art funding disappearing at the fast rate that it's going, I am actually really passionate about this thing, beauty and art, which I think is paramount to what it means to be a human being.
Yeah. Christianity's had quite a mixed relationship with that, hasn't it? In that, think kind of pre-Reformation, there was a lot of art and it was absolutely central. And then it was kind of not allowed. I'm wondering what the legacy of that period of time when all of the art was removed from churches. Do you think that we still have the legacy of that now? Do you notice it?
Yeah, I think, well, as art in the late 19th century shifted into a kind of secular space, so it got separated from God. So beauty got separated from God, the kind of artistic expression, which has always had a problem because we understand what it means to put things into words, but art is less tangible. We can't get hold of it. And so whereas it was used in many points in history to convey gospel to those who were illiterate, where words couldn't be used, art came and stepped in, or it was a way of displaying glorification. But then you got yourself into a muddle about this idea of the transcendent, and actually you have removed something about who God is. You've diminished him in some respect to say he's kind of shown up here. So there's always been this fight, and also art has kind of been seen as audacious or frivolous, and how do you care for the poor? So there's always this balance which has gone on within Christianity, and fights that go backwards and forwards, and ideas of idolatry, etc., and iconography has caused quite a lot of problems within that. But I think one of the biggest shifts for where we are in the church today was art has shifted itself out of a God space, out of being rooted within Christianity into a secular space. And then your experience of it becomes sublime, and sublime is not a theological term. And so when you shift into that, the church then saw it as other. And then it's up to the same kind of corruption that anything else would be that's hit the secular world. So then how do we let it back in again? Well, we can only let it back into the church as long as it so obviously is about God. So unless it's a painting of Jesus, it's not welcome. You can have music that sounds like U2, but it's got to be Matt Redman singing about the glorification of God and how he's coming down to save us. So it can only be redeemed with full, explicit Christian content. And then you also have this subsect of a person called a Christian artist, which is, I don't even know what to do with that idea. Like, what does that even mean? Like, you're an artist, you're not an artist. And so, this idea of Christian artist is this kind of warped idea of the redemption of the creative to make it acceptable to church. So, we are living out of the divorce of arts from Christianity rather than a legacy of the arts being so included within Christianity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There is always a tendency, isn't there, to have a kind of a sacred secular divide.
Absolutely.
I think what you're saying is that is really, really very much exemplified in our relationship to the arts.
Yeah, completely. Yeah. And also, it's a complicated conversation. There was periods of time where in industrialization, where art kind of exploded as a sort of an escape some sort of an attempt to reclaim beauty in its mysterious nature, which was disappearing with the rise of science. And so Charles Taylor would talk about we're in a time of disenchantment. So we have lost a sense of the mystery and the enchantment. So if you lose those things and art speaks to those things, then art has no place. But we're even seeing that now in the secular space. So I don't think that is just a Christian issue.
No, no, but it has been a Christian issue. I'm just wondering what the connection is between art and the sort of the academic sphere that you're in, and how students are able to express their learning and their understanding. You talked about words. We know what to do with words, don't we? As you were saying, and they're much more easily controlled because it's much easier to see whether somebody's got the right answer. And so the way that academia has assessed things and understood things and expressed things becomes kind of the normal way of doing it. So I'm just wondering about some of your students who might be coming from slightly less academic background, whether there is space to do some of their expressing of what they're learning in alternative artistic ways, or whether that is sort of still a work in progress, really.
Still a massive work in progress. Yeah, so they can do it in my module on art and theology, but nowhere else.
Mm.
So whenever you do creative stuff, how's it quantifiable and how do you mark it? How would you know what a 70% is? And it's always the equivalent of 1,000 words. Like, I've just had a student who's written an original piece of music to trace the beginnings of Genesis. So when was creation? When was the kind of creativity first birthed? And it's a really phenomenal piece of work. It's only about 5 minutes long. And, I'm likely to give him a really good grade for that. I'm going to have to write a justification to the moderator.
That's really interesting. So you can give it that grade so long as you put some words in place to explain it.
Yeah, because, I used to be an interior designer, a graphic designer, and I know what it means to get a brief. There is no equivalent within academia, within, this type of academia, that has that creative brief, because the creative brief sets the tone, sets the parameters, and then you work out have they marked against those parameters. But the syllabus that we have to mark them against and the learning outcomes doesn't correlate to the idea of brief.
Yeah, yeah. I had a conversation a number of years ago with a guy who was going for training for the Anglican ministry from a very sort of not from an academic background, and somebody with dyslexia who found all of that stuff quite difficult.
Yeah.
And he was saying how much he struggled on the course, but there was one module where he was allowed to do something creative, and he created something in wood. And he talked about how that was the space where he really felt a sense of connection and being understood and affirmation. And he enjoyed that one. All of the essays and things he really struggled with.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
Yeah. And there's an incredible amount to be said. But I mean, I did my postgraduate studies at Regent College in Vancouver, which really promotes the Christian imagination and Christian arts. One of my assignments, I did it from an artistic point of view, and it was seated at the table with all my enemies, and I had all of these dummies set up around a dinner table, and they were all my own personal enemies on the faces. And it took 3 people to mark it, because they had to work how to unpack it. And I remember feeling this sense of, because I'm dyslexic as well, I had learnt so much more through doing that.
It sounds like for you, once you are speaking artistically, you're speaking in your heart language. So the learning becomes very, very natural. Whereas
Yes,
if you've got to translate that into
absolutely.
words that are difficult and awkward and don't do what you want them to, then
Yeah,
the learning, almost the learning gets lost in the process to a
yeah,
degree.
that's because you're spending too much time trying to articulate to the point where you get so immersed in that you've forgotten
Yeah.
what point you're trying to make over here. And also, listen, I see this a lot with the pioneers because in practice, a lot of them are instant reflectors.
Mm.
So they're out there doing their practice, reflecting almost in the moment. You know, if they're setting up an event, they could go in with a kind of outline of what the event is. When they turn up, they didn't expect this group of people to get here and they realise their event doesn't really speak to this group of people. So they change the narrative, they change the maybe even some of the elements of the event in the moment, in real time. And then they come to write a theological reflection, and it was deeply theological what they were doing. But unless they're with a notebook, they don't know what they reflected on. But I do think it's really interesting. Whereas if I then said, do a piece of art about this, I bet you they could do it
Yeah.
because it would be hands on. They could visualize it, bring all the pieces together that they're thinking, that they've acted out. But shifting that into the words makes it purely in the left side of the brain, and they've got rid of everything that was on the right.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That reflective space is really valuable, though, isn't it? When I was chatting to Rob Rogers, he was talking about, as a practitioner, the fact that actually having some time at CMS gave him the opportunity to reflect on his practice,
Yeah.
which was really, really valuable. So the reflection is really good at that opportunity to sort of step back
Yeah.
and understand what you're doing in a different way, and then bring that learning back into the space of practice, I think is really,
Yeah.
really key. But it's kind of how you help people to do that. When we were talking before, Sarah, you were talking about some research that you'd done that had been sparked by actually seeing people's spiritual connection with art. Do you want to share a bit about that?
Yeah, so one of our modules is community development. And part of that, we went to visit community developers in Stoke-on-Trent. And Stoke-on-Trent has got this rich history of pottery and art, but there's this weird remnant of it there as the kind of pottery. You know, this probably isn't very fair to Stokies to talk about it in this way, but a lot of that industry went out the door, and then people don't feel a sense of pride in what they're doing because their pride's left. But that artistry still hangs around. You can still feel, I can't explain it properly, but it's that feeling. You can feel creativity and the artistic endeavor or inspiration in the place.
I'd just share with you, I had a friend who, she and her husband were pastoring a church in one of the council estates at Stoke.
Oh, right, yeah.
She's an artist, but has grown up in that kind of environment. And so acknowledging the importance of her own art took a while. But they put on an art exhibition in their church.
Yeah.
And suddenly, from this council estate, people started turning up with art that they had completely unexpectedly. And I went and saw it. It was the most moving thing. And you would not, if you walked along those streets, you would not expect there to be all of this art in Abbey Holton in these council houses. But they had all turned up and there was masses of it, absolutely masses of it.
That does not surprise me.
So you're right, it's in the air.
Yeah, and we went to this project, and it was women who, I think it was women that had been abused or been in some sort of domestic violence or had been working in prostitution. It was a collection, but basically it was women that had been downtrodden in some way or another as a result of being women. And they had this art project going on. And when you walked in there, I had met a couple of those women beforehand and felt the kind of deprivation of their spirit. But when I went there and I saw them involved in art, I could feel the elevation of their spirit. So I can't explain it again. It's one of those kind of mysterious non-tangibles of art, but there was something of that. And it may not work in any other place. And also, I heard a story of this woman who is kind of the matriarch of the family. Nobody in her family had ever had a job. And, there was just years on years of lack of self-worth, and they were just about survival. And they went to this thing in Stoke, and there was a quartet there, and she'd never seen live instruments, and she'd carried the weight, horrible stories of suffering, of prison sentences, of all sorts of different things, and she'd had to hold all that together. And when she heard this quartet, she wept. And that sounds so minimal, but she was a grandmother or great grandmother, and there she was singing an instrument being played for the first time, and it moved her to tears. And she wept and wept, not just a little bit of tears, but wept. And I think, to me, there's something about that experience of the arts that cuts through to spirits, and it goes across all different backgrounds and experiences.
Yeah. So where did that lead you to next?
So that's what set on the inquiry of just realising how phenomenally important the arts is to how we consider life, how we think about ourselves spiritually. And ironically now I teach at a mission organisation on ministry and mission, when it's something that I've always kind of veered off that. But what I want people to do is to come into an experience with the Creator, with the Trinity. And there is something about the arts that brings people into that relationship, whether it's known or unknown.
Yeah.
And it connects to the spirit, the mind, and the body, holistic. And my investigation, my inquiry, what is it about the arts that takes people into those places? And it took me on my own journey as well, for my own spirituality.
One of the things that occurred to me as you were speaking is that at some level it feels quite important that the art that somebody is creating is allowed to speak for itself, without going back to the beginning of our conversation, without that having kind of requirement before you start creating of, well, this needs to be a picture of Jesus, or this needs to be overtly spiritual. And if it becomes overtly spiritual, then great. But it feels like, to kind of what you were describing in that woman's response was a very, you could say, a very right brain kind of response, but it's sort of coming from deep within, isn't it? It's very much of connection. And if you start putting frames around that, well, this needs to be Christian art, then that feels like it would pollute that space to some extent.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it was a very Renaissance idea that we're all creative. And, indeed, I have taught that previously, that we're all creative because we're made in the image of creation. I think that we do all respond to creativity.
Yeah.
There is something deep within all of us that responds to creativity. And if we got rid of, all the art funding's disappearing, and we are systematising, really putting boundaries around the outcome of art. So the University of the Arts in London is been consistently accused of really putting boundaries around what art is, and the church kind of puts all these boundaries around what art is. And I say, as myself as an artist, what's your style? Is this copied from somebody's? And I'm just saying, leave me be. Yes, maybe give me a few things, but creativity is, by its very nature, it's experimental and it's individual, and it's an expression of learning. It's you come into one bit of creativity and it shifts you to another place. This all feeds back to me, to Adam, like when we were given the earth, Adam and Eve, we have screwed up what it means to look after the earth and have this dominion over it. But what if we're asked to cultivate it and join with it? And I think art's very similar. You cultivate and join in with this creative process. And so you don't know where that's going to go or where it's going to move. And we have been so keen on boundaries and categorising and crushing and squashing that I'm not surprised the art funding has disappeared, because we've forgotten to value it as it is. And, that story of your friend in Stoke kind of stands out to me, because these people that wouldn't be perceived by the galleries as people who were artists, and yet they're bringing their art. Well, who says they can't do art?
Yeah. If we're understanding that we have an innate connection to the creative, then we can trust that people will meet the divine in the context of the creative.
Absolutely, they will. Absolutely, they will. And quite which aspect of the Trinity that you meet, we are participating in that which our Creator put out there for us.
Yeah. 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 You don't need to be able to draw a sunset to be moved by it.
Indeed, absolutely.
Yeah. So, what did you discover about how people connect through art?
Watching student, there's a exercise I do in my module every year, and every year there's more than one student cries. And I think when we're moved by the arts, that there is a Professor Dick in the Netherlands. He said the body doesn't differentiate how it learns. And so I think when you watch people engage with the arts or have an experience of the arts, even if they're not visibly moved by it, there'll be something that they've taken and inhabited that they didn't have before.
Yeah.
I think even the way we lay out the arts these days, you don't give any people the space to be able to inhabit the art. They get trundled around thinking that they've got to have come up with some intellectual response to what they're seeing, some educational experience of what it is they're seeing. Or we think if we've experienced, we've got to have known it ourselves. But what I think I see within people is they're met on a number of different levels, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, physically.
John O'Donoghue, one of the things that he speaks about is that sense that when we encounter beauty, there is both a coming alive and a surrender that happens at the same time. I think that's a beautiful description of what it can feel like.
Yes, you're right. He is one of my favourite people to speak about beauty. And even when you read his blessings, you see that thing goes on in his blessings as well. That you have this kind of your eyes are opened, but you also surrender.
Yeah. One of my very early podcasts, I talked about beauty and spirituality. And that was kind of John O'Donoghue, the sort of my ponderings, having read some of his stuff.
Yeah.
You were beginning to talk about where your journey, your spiritual journey has gone in connection to this.
Yes, and it's I think when I look back now, I mean, I became a Christian when I was 26, and your zeal for Christianity after that is, it's kind of off the charts. And within 2 weeks of becoming a Christian, I left my job as an interior designer and went to work for Tear Fund, and then went off to serve the poor in all the countries around the world. Because I thought interior design wasn't Christian, which, it's so daft. But if I look back now, I think I could have joined all the pieces together. And I've been around council estates and I used to do a lot of voluntary work. And I think now, if somebody gave me a chunk of money, I'd love to go back and meet with councils and say to them, let's paint these places or design to add beauty in, to give people pride. Why would you have pride in something that's grey and looks like a prison?
I'm wondering, in that moment of kind of new Christian enthusiasm when you left your design job, whether in the process of doing that, you found yourself leaving behind some of that creative person that you were.
Yes, I did lose something. And whichever job I'm in, I try and bring my creative side back in. And before I did interior design, I was a visual merchandiser for Next. When I got to the end of a project, I did always feel a bit flat, but it didn't have a depth, if that makes sense. So I definitely need to bring my left and right brain together. There does need to be the academic for me with the art and creativity, which is what I've recognised, and went into theological training and kind of discovering through reading Thomas Merton that if God is anything, he is love. And so therefore, if we are anything, we are love. He is the event love, and so we are the event love. And through kind of getting into being an artist, and because I've always been an artist, if I want to find my being, stop trying to find it. Just get in creation and do art, because this is who you are. And as you discover more about who you are, you will discover more about the creator because you're made in his image. And so this moving into embracing the arts without question and creation without inhibition, I'm trusting that through the literature that I read, that my spirit is going to respond to the arts and creation, and that my spirit will respond to connecting to God through obedience. So the obedience is not to force myself to do those things. The obedience is to let this period of time be. So there was communication going on and experience going on, but just in a different way. So then in this last month, this shift has been to an attentiveness to subtle changes in my spirit, because they feel painful well, why am I doing that? Because if God is anything, God says, come be yourself before me. And to really find out, to be made in the image of God, to find your own sense of being, is to be more yourself, not less. And there is an acknowledgement of these deep works that God is doing in me that I don't have words for.
So the art and the creative and nature are places where you feel much more at home and more yourself?
Yes, and I submitted to them as the truest side of my nature. As a dyslexic, in order to understand anything, I have to work really, 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 really hard.
Yeah.
Once I work out the first principles, I then don't have to work that hard. Whereas the arts, no effort is required. I'm coming home to myself.
Yes, that's a phrase that's been in my mind as you've been talking, that kind of sense of coming home.
When I'm doing creativity, you could probably have a herd of elephants going through the room and I may not notice.
Yeah, so you're completely in the flow.
Absolutely immersed, especially if I'm playing the cello.
It sounds like there was a part of you that you hadn't connected with when you were working before you became a Christian. So the kind of the artistic side of things was definitely there.
Yeah.
But then there was a connection or something that you encountered, that you met, that was really, really crucial at that moment of becoming a Christian. But then there have been pieces of yourself that you've ended up leaving behind in kind of doing the good Christian journey with all of that enthusiasm.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I mean, I was reading Teresa of Avila and Dietrich Bonhoeffer 2 weeks after becoming a Christian. So I've always been inquisitive. I've always wanted to know why. And I've always wanted to have deep conversation. But I think, and Tear Fund it's varying on the conservative evangelical, at least it was when I worked there. And so you did shift away from the art. And, the kind of belief that I was taught then was that a Christian job was working for a parachurch organisation or the church. You didn't have so-called secular jobs.
Absolutely, absolutely. Which comes back to that conversation that we had about music right at the beginning. What is a Christian artist? Well, we are artists created in the image of God.
Yes.
It's interesting that actually the spirituality that you were drawn to very early on, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Teresa of Avila, is very kind of contemplative, right brain, heart-led stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
It seems that it quite often happens to people, that they have this incredible encounter with God that touches something deep. And then in the process of trying to understand that and make sense of it and live it out, can get sucked in by a Christian culture that does not teach us how to observe and connect with where God is connecting with us. Yeah. And instead, we kind of end up sort of moving into a box and leaving bits of ourselves behind, and the need to kind of come around the circle and re-find those pieces. That's really not an uncommon experience, I think.
No, I think you're right. We're all made in the image of God, and we all have something to bring to the situation. And so recognizing what it means being made in the image of God means that I now have the freedom as well to pick up experiences of God in all things. Whereas I think that narrative that I'd grown up with was it's only through the church, by the church, to the church, for the church.
Yeah, yeah. In that sense that we have a different, superior level of contribution that we make because we're Christians, which is not borne out by what we see in the world.
Yeah, exactly. The arts is one of the key ways to mission is through the creative, through the right brain. Margaret Wheatley, in her discussions about leadership, says that the future of leadership is through a much more right brain. And in fact, she calls it a feminine leadership, that actually, whilst everything sits within this idea of the left brain and all left brain ways of doing stuff, we're not going to be holistic beings. We're not going to be integrated people. I think that my aim is to shift into a much more balanced idea of left and right, and to not think necessarily about what I've lost in art, but how do I, and I'm sitting with art much more than I was before, but it's because I'm trying to regrow that muscle.
Just thinking about the fact that we are called to live by the Spirit and not by the law, I'm wondering whether there is a bit of a correlation between the law, which is all about writing and written and rules, and is easy to police from the outside. I think that's part of the reason that art doesn't get space.
Yes.
Because if you're leading a church or a community or a denomination, then words create barriers and rules, and you can work out whether people are in the box that you want them to be in or not. Whereas Jesus' description of the Spirit, that Jesus says that if those are born of the Spirit, like the wind, that you don't know where they're going to or where they're coming from.
Yeah.
But it's very difficult to control somebody who's working in that space, or to give them rules, or to mark their work.
Well, there's a great little book by a guy called Gordon McKinsey, who used to be the creative director for Allmark, called Orbiting the Giant Hairball. And he talks about the hairball being the institution, but he's got a great little picture in it. Like half the page is pictures and the other half is written stuff. And he talks about how you're out in space, the astronaut go out into space. You want to have a wiggly line connecting them to the spaceship, because otherwise, if you go too far down that creative route, you've gone. But then God does give us boundaries. That's the point. And you can't create outside God. The Spirit does hold us to account, but in a different way, and allow ourselves to be creative and perhaps mentor one another, but not in a heavy-handed way.
I frequently use as an anchor point that bit in Galatians,
Yeah.
where Paul is talking about, well, how do you work out what it means to be walking with the Spirit?
Yeah.
Well, because it has Spirit-like fruit: love,
Yeah.
joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, all of
Yeah.
those things.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not that it's an absolute free-for-all.
No.
But it's about shalom, wholeness, isn't it? It's about
absolutely it is.
being who you are.
Like, why are we doing anything? Like I'm constantly saying to students, great, but what are we doing it for? If we're heading to the redemption of all things and shalom, then think about how what we're doing heads towards that. According to Ian McGilchrist, I think it's something horrible that 80% of people under 30 feel like life is meaningless. And we're left to curate our own meaning. And I think I don't have to create my own meaning. I know what my meaning is, but I have to learn to walk into it, because I feel meaningless, because I feel all these other things. And even my dark night of the soul has made me feel meaningless because the meaning has been taken away from my life. So now I have to go back to it with obedience, which is what Thomas Merton has taught me.
Yeah.
And the engagement with beauty and the arts came to me through a secular women wilding circle. But I have found it outside of the faith, but not outside of God. I don't believe there is an outside of God.
Absolutely. So what would you want to say to people kind of at the beginning of their journey? Like if you could go back to Sarah, who's about to leave her interior design job and rush off with Tier Fund, and obviously there will be things that you have, ways that you will have grown and learnt that you wouldn't have done if you hadn't done that. So it's not that anything's wasted, but I wonder what you would say to her now.
I would have got a spiritual director. I mean, even that's a risk. Get somebody who's trying to push you down the whatever path. And I look back now and I think formation spirituality circles are really powerful. I'd have perhaps joined one of those, and I wouldn't have been hasty to make decisions. But I think the Ignatian spiritual circle helps you, like the prayer circle. It was through my spirit that I met Christ. If I look back now, I would have given myself more space and time, and I would have pushed more into the contemplative stuff.
The great gift of the Ignatian spirituality is that it's all about discerning what's going on within you, isn't it?
Yeah.
Rather than allowing somebody else or a sort of a system of thought to interpret what's going on and give it labels that might not fit it.
Yeah.
And the other thing that occurs to me is that probably you would have kept with a broader sense of where the spiritual is to be found, that it is everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I did understand that, even though I didn't know how to verbalise it. There was some, when I look back now, there was some profound understandings of God very early on in my faith, and some real depth of experience of Him. I used to see it as needing to have the whole understanding of our faith with all the different aspects, the contemplative, the scholarly, the philosophical inquiry, all these different things. But in the last of 2 or 3 years in pioneering, I'm like, oh no, this has opened up to far bigger than that. There's this really great book called Rescuing the Gospel Back from the Cowboys, written by a guy called Richard Twist. And you suddenly realise how God has revealed himself through the First Nations narrative, not through Christianity as it is placed itself. St. Francis of Assisi picks up on, God is in everything, and even in the carrot. And yet the spirituality of First Nations already embodied all of that.
Yeah.
So, and then you go, oh, hang on a second. God shows up in all these different places. Who's to say God didn't turn up to the First Nations before?
Well, I want to say, of course. Of course, God was already there.
Absolutely. And their connection with the land, when they were allowed to be themselves, is exceptional.
Yeah.
To the point when all the Westerners romped up to America and said, it's a beautiful, bountiful world full of absolute glory. And then they trashed it all because they disconnected from the land. If we understand God is in the whole world, that there isn't a divide, when you understand God in all things, and yes, you need to be careful of some stuff. And I think I always knew that God was in all things, in all places. But I didn't inhabit that as a way to live because the church crushed it out of me.
Yeah. Yeah. And because once you begin inhabiting the community of church, then other things kind of often they don't have the space because you're part of this group that sees the world in a particular way. And so you naturally end up just sort of leaving behind some of those perspectives.
If you don't have conversation partners, then you don't have community around it.
It feels like there's a bit of a parallel. My own experience of exploring the feminine divine.
Yes.
That I have done quite a lot of that exploring and have a much, much richer understanding and connection with God as feminine as well as masculine and as well as transcendent, which has been beautiful. But there is not a rich space of community in which to actually practice and explore that. So I can do all of that thinking outside. I can do all of that thinking and connecting, but if I step into the sort of the Christian community church space, people are quite uncomfortable with that. They don't know what to do with it. I feel quite uncomfortable about bringing expression and practice that would feel very uncomfortable to everybody else, so I don't. And then I feel it's sort of sliding away, and I have to very deliberately go back out and re-find it. And gradually that's become integrated, but it's taking a long time. It's not a finished work. And it feels like there is a parallel to that thing about the art and about God being in everything, that you can have that understanding, and you had that through your kind of contemplative reading. But when you are inhabiting a community that doesn't know what that's about, I mean, partly it's all about time, isn't it? If you're spending a lot of time within this community that doesn't see that and doesn't understand that, then that you kind of have to leave that part of you at the door to an extent because it doesn't fit.
I think there is a real importance in trying to find a community.
Sometimes I think it's for a season, in that you need to establish the new thing properly, and then that's not in danger of disappearing, and then you can re-engage with something where it's not, because it's already established in you, and there will be things within the old thing that are still useful, but they're not any longer threatening the thing that's grown within you, I think. That's been really good. Hope you enjoyed this episode of the Loved Called Gifted podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, you can email lovedcalledgifted@gmail.com. You can find a transcript of this podcast at lovedcalledgifted.com, and that's also the place to go if you're interested in the Loved Called Gifted course, or if you'd like to find out about spiritual direction or coaching. Thank you for listening.